In 1892, deep in the isolated ridges of Pike County, Kentucky, men began vanishing with a kind of silence that didn't leave tracks, witnesses, or bodies, just empty space where a person used to be. Over 9 years, 7 men would disappear without explanation, and in a place where the wilderness was blamed for everything. The mountains did what they always did, swallowed the noise and kept moving. Out there, the silence between settlements wasn't peaceful. It was protective, like a curtain pulled tight over whatever happened in the hollows. If you're here riding with us into the dark corners, folks pretend assumed don't exist, subscribe, and comment your city so we know how far the truth reaches. Back then, the Cumberland Plateau was basically its own world, cut off by steep ridges, thick timber, busted trails, and weather that could erase a man's path in a single night. Pikeville, the county seat, sat miles away, but distance in the mountains wasn't measured in miles. It was measured in hours, injuries, and whether the creek was up. In winter and early spring, floods and snow made travel feel impossible, and whole families could go months without seeing anyone outside their own blood. Law enforcement was thin, spread across hundreds of square miles, and most folks survived by farming small patches, trapping, moonshining, and doing whatever they could to get through seasons that didn't care about prayers or plans. In that kind of country, disappearances didn't always set off alarms. A trapper might not come back, and people would shrug, bear, fall, sickness, or he simply moved west chasing better land and better luck. Communities were used to men drifting in and out, and the mountains gave everyone an easy excuse not to look too hard. But Pike County had another truth hiding under those excuses patterns. Because when men vanish once, it's tragedy. When they vanish again and again in the same stretch of hollows, it stops being bad luck, starts feeling like something is hunting. And that's what made this story different. The disappearances weren't spread across the whole county like random accidents. They clustered, tight, around Panther Creek, a rough watershed where the forest grew thick, and the sunlight struggled to reach the valley floor even at midday. The deeper you went, the darker it got, like the trees were leaning in to listen. And right there, inside that heavy silence, sat a shuttered homestead tucked into the hillside, belonging to a reclusive widow named Elizabeth Pike, an herbalist known to some as a healer, and to others as the kind of woman you didn't visit, unless you had no other choice. Elizabeth Pike had been a widow since 1883, when her husband Josiah died the way mountain men sometimes did, quick, brutal, and swallowed by work. A logging accident crushed him beneath a falling poplar, leaving Elizabeth alone with a modest homestead carved into a hillside hollow and 4 children who were still growing into themselves. The cabin sat far off the nearest road, reached only by a narrow trail that twisted through dense timber, the kind of path that turned into mud in spring and danger in winter. After Josiah's death, Elizabeth didn't move closer to people or help. She pulled tighter into the mountains, like grief didn't soften her. It sealed her. Over the years, she gained a reputation among scattered families as a skilled herbalist. Folks said she could treat wounds, brew strong medicines, and deliver babies using nothing but roots, bark, and mountain knowledge passed down in whispers. In a place starving for doctors, that kind of skill made people tolerate a lot. But the Pike cabin didn't feel like a healer's home. It felt guarded. The windows stayed shuttered, the door stayed barred even in daylight, and the air around the place carried that uncomfortable message you feel before you can explain it. You are not welcome here. In the spring of 1888, a traveling peddler named Silas Dockery made the hard trip to her cabin to sell fabric and household goods. In his journal, he described Elizabeth as a woman around 40, with prematurely gray hair pulled into a severe bun, pale skin that looked almost translucent in the dim cabin light, and eyes that followed him like they didn't blink enough. She was unusually tall, near 6 feet, with long fingers that moved with deliberate precision as she inspected his wares. Dockery noticed how quiet the place was. No laughter, no easy talk, no warm mess of family life. Just stillness. The kind that makes a visitor talk faster just to fill the space. What she bought unsettled him more than anything: heavy chain and metal hardware. Elizabeth told him it was for securing livestock against bears. But Dockery didn't see a single animal when he arrived, didn't hear a moo or a bleat the entire time, not even a clink of a trough. Stranger still, she paid in silver coins, real money, despite the cabin looking like hard living and patched survival. Her clothes were plain and mended, but the fabric wasn't the cheap, rough stuff most mountain families wore. It was finer, intentional, like someone cared about appearances even while hiding from the world. Her children appeared only briefly, 3 sons and a daughter, watching the stranger with the same hard stillness as their mother. They didn't speak, didn't ask questions, didn't move like curious kids. When Dockery tried polite conversation, asking how they managed alone up there and mentioning their father, Elizabeth ended it with words chosen like a lock clicking shut. They handled their affairs according to God's design, she said, and they had no need of the outside world's interference. Dockery left the homestead with relief, writing that the Pike cabin didn't feel like a home. It felt like a fortress built to keep the world out and something unnamed in. The first man to vanish was Thomas Garrett, a 32-year-old trapper from Virginia who came into Pike County in October 1883 chasing what he called virgin territory for beaver and mink. Garrett wasn't reckless or green. He was the careful type, kept notes, planned routes, and stayed in touch with home through letters sent from whatever settlement he passed through. That's why, when Christmas came and went with no word, his wife knew something was off. She wrote the Pike County sheriff, telling him Thomas always sent notice if he was delayed. The sheriff filed the report and offered the standard mountain answer: trappers lose time, storms hit, accidents happen, and sometimes a man simply doesn't come back. Then it happened again. In 1885, a second trapper named Henry Booth disappeared after being seen buying supplies in a settlement called Elkhorn. People watched him head out toward the hollows near Panther Creek, confident and stalked, like a man who expected to return. He never did. His brother traveled down from Ohio and searched until his boots split, finally finding Booth's abandoned camp. Equipment scattered like he'd stepped away for only a moment. The fire was dead. The woods were too quiet, and there was no sign of a struggle big enough to explain why a skilled outdoorsman would leave his gear behind and vanish into thin air. In 1887, it wasn't a trapper. It was a moonshiner named Caleb Yates, a man already used to danger and secrecy. Before he disappeared, he told associates he'd found a hidden hollow with a cold, clear spring. Perfect for a still site nobody would ever discover. That kind of find was worth money, and men got greedy over less. Caleb walked into that hollow smiling and never walked out. After him came 2 more disappearances in 1889 and 1890. Both experienced trappers who knew the rules of survival and weren't the type to drown in a creek or wander lost in familiar terrain. By 1891, the list had grown to 7 missing men over 9 years, and the pattern started to smell wrong even in a county used to bad luck. That's when Deputy Marshal James Thornton began paying attention in a way others didn't. Thornton was 42, a Civil War veteran who had marched through rough mountain country and learned the difference between random violence and planned cruelty. Where other men shrugged and blamed the wilderness, Thornton studied. He collected the reports, interviewed families, and mapped the last known locations like he was drawing a boundary around a predator's territory. And every line he traced bent back toward the same place: Panther Creek, a tight radius of hollows where the forest grew thick and the daylight felt weaker. At the center of that circle sat the Pike homestead, shuttered, isolated, and quiet as a closed mouth. The mountains could kill a man, sure, but Thornton couldn't ignore what his map was telling him. These men weren't just getting lost. They were being taken. Thornton made his first visit to the Pike property in November 1891, riding with another deputy along a narrow trail that wound deeper into timber until the woods seemed to thicken on purpose, as if the land itself wanted to hide what lay ahead. When they reached the clearing, the cabin sat low and dark against the hillside, shutters closed tight like eyelids that refused to open. It didn't look abandoned, just sealed. Before either man could fully dismount, the front door opened, and Elizabeth Pike stepped into the frame, already in position, already blocking the entrance with her tall, rigid posture. She didn't look startled to see lawmen. She looked prepared. Thornton explained calmly that men had been disappearing in the Panther Creek area, and he was checking every property nearby for sightings, sounds, anything unusual. Elizabeth listened without interrupting, her face polite in the way a blade can be polite, smooth, controlled, and cold. When he finished, her answer came fast and measured, like she'd practiced saying it until it sounded like scripture. She told him they kept to themselves, saw no trespassers on their land, and couldn't account for the fates of strangers who chose to wander these mountains. Her words were careful, almost legal, giving him nothing to grab onto. While she spoke, Thornton's eyes moved. He noticed things that didn't match the story the cabin was trying to tell. Through a crack in the shutter, he caught the warm glow of quality candles, expensive for a family that should have been burning cheap tallow. Her dress was patched, but the cloth beneath those patches looked finer than what most mountain women could afford. The cabin felt poor, but not truly struggling. More like it was hiding its resources the way it hid its light. Thornton asked if he could step inside, just to look around, to reassure himself and close the question. Elizabeth's expression didn't change, but her body shifted a half step, perfectly timed, perfectly placed, to block any view of the interior. She told him he had no warrant and no cause. Her home was her sanctuary, she said, and she would not allow a violation of that sanctity. It wasn't a threat, but it carried the weight of one. Thornton felt the frustration rise in his throat. Word of bow, he knew she was right. Instinct didn't count as evidence. Intuition didn't let you tear through a private home, even in a county where law was often whatever a man could enforce. He looked past her and saw the children, brief outlines moving in shadow, silent faces watching like they were part of the cabin itself. None of them spoke. None of them smiled. The stillness around them wasn't just shyness. It was something trained. So Thornton left, turning his horse back down that trail with his jaw tight, carrying a feeling he couldn't file as fact, that the cabin wasn't just isolated. It was containing something. But without a witness, without a body, without proof, the law had nothing to do except wait. And in the mountains, waiting was how evil got comfortable. Everything finally cracked open in March 1895. When William Sturgis stumbled into the settlement at Dorton, about 15 miles from the Pike homestead, looking like a man who had crawled out of hell and didn't fully make it back. His arms and chest were scorched with burns, his clothes hung off him like rags, and his eyes carried the kind of terror that doesn't fade just because you're surrounded by people. Sturgis wasn't a trapper who could be written off as lost in the mountains. He was a Lexington businessman in Pike County to survey timber opportunities. And when that kind of man vanished, folks with money started pushing hard for answers. Dr. Marcus Henderson, the local country doctor, took him in and wrote down his account in urgent, shaky notes while Sturgis drifted in and out of fever. Sturgis said a sudden snowstorm caught him on the trail, and the Pike cabin offered him shelter. Calm voices, a warm fire, a kind of hospitality that felt almost church, clean on the surface. He accepted, ate, drank, and then woke up underground, chained to bedrock in a chamber that smelled like damp earth, smoke, and old suffering. He wasn't alone, other men were down there too, broken in different ways, injured, starving, half mad from being held so long without daylight or hope. He described being kept compliant with food and drink laced with sedatives brewed from mountain plants. And he spoke of Elizabeth Pike's bloodline preservation. Beliefs, religion twisted into permission for cruelty, where captives were forced to witness rituals meant to bind the family tighter under her control. Sturgis said he escaped only because the youngest son, Jacob, finally cracked under the weight of what his mother had made them become. Jacob helped him slip free, then set a fire in the chamber's wooden supports as a distraction, a last act of defiance that cost him his life and left Sturgis burned but alive, before Sturgis passed out again. Henderson, there were shallow graves on the property and belongings kept like a record, proof that people hadn't simply wandered off. Henderson's notes turned into the first solid piece of the case. Not rumor, not instinct, but a living witness putting a name to the darkness behind those shutters. By the time Dr. Marcus Henderson finished recording Sturgis's testimony, the silence around Panther Creek was dead. Sheriff Garrett Blackburn didn't treat this like another missing trapper report filed and forgotten. This time there was a living witness, clear accusations, and enough detail to finally justify a warrant. Before dawn on March 18, 1895, Blackburn gathered a posse of 12 men, including Deputy Marshal James Thornton, and they rode out hard toward the Pike homestead. Late, winter snow still clung to the ridges, turning the trail into a slow fight, but nobody complained. The whole group moved with that tight, grim energy men get when they're finally going to confirm what they've feared for years. They reached the clearing around midday. Smoke curled from the chimney like the cabin was alive and breathing, but the place itself sat unnaturally still. No barking dog, no chopping wood, no footsteps in the yard. Thornton called out for the family to come outside. After a long moment, the door opened slow, and Elizabeth Pike stepped into view with a calm so wrong it made the air feel colder. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't scared. She looked like she'd been expecting the law to arrive eventually, and had already decided how she'd meet it. Behind her stood her children, 2 grown sons and a daughter, pale, quiet, hollow-eyed, moving like people who had been trained to stand still and obey. Elizabeth tried to deny them again, saying they had no authority on her land, but this time it didn't land. Thornton had the warrant, and he read it to her plain. When he told her they were searching the property and taking the family in for kidnapping and murder, her expression tightened into something harder than defiance. Like offense. She said they didn't understand what they were interrupting, that her family carried a sacred lineage, that what she'd done was God's work. One of the sons shifted as if to block the doorway, but Thornton drew his weapon and ordered them to step away. No hero talk, no drama, just cold command. And the Pike family obeyed, standing stiff in the March wind while the posse moved in. The search didn't take long because evil can hide, but it can't erase structure. Within 20 minutes they found the entrance, a trapdoor concealed beneath burlap sacks, and stored potatoes in a root cellar. The ladder dropped into a chamber carved into bedrock, about 15 feet down, reinforced with timber supports. The air down there hit them like rot and smoke, and some beams still smoldered from the fire Sturgis described. Along the walls were chains anchored into stone, 4 sets, long enough for a man to stand and turn, but not long enough to reach the ladder out. In one corner lay a body, dead less than a week, wasted and wounded in a way that made the men look away, even while they forced themselves to keep looking. Later they identified him as Samuel Denning, a trapper reported missing 3 months earlier. That single body, in that single room, turned years of suspicion into undeniable reality. The men hadn't been lost. They had been kept. And some had been killed right there in the dark. The deeper the posse searched, the more the Pike homestead stopped looking like an odd, isolated cabin and started looking like a place designed for control. Near Elizabeth's sleeping area, they found a wooden chest that wasn't filled with family keepsakes or tools. It was filled with other people's lives. Pocket watches, wedding rings, wire-rimmed spectacles, letters folded in yellowing business cards, small personal items a man carries when he believes he'll be back home soon. And the way it was arranged made the men's stomachs turn. Sorted, labeled with names and dates, like Elizabeth kept a ledger in her head and trophies in her hands. That wasn't mountain survival. That was a record. Then they found the second chamber. It was accessed through a narrow passage tighter and lower, like the earth itself was trying to close around it. In there, they discovered crude wooden boxes, small, infant-sized, buried and stacked like somebody was trying to hide shame while still marking ownership. Dates were carved into the lids. When the boxes were opened, the truth landed heavy and final: 3 infant remains, each one dead within days of birth, each one showing signs that matched exactly what Sturgis had described. What the lawman had prayed was exaggerated or delirium. Even men who'd seen war lynchings and frontier violence stood silent, because there are some sights that don't fit inside a normal man's mind. Deputy Thornton, the same man who had held his composure through battlefields, broke right there in the daylight, when those boxes were carried up from the dark. It wasn't just death. It was innocence destroyed by design. Elizabeth Pike didn't fight when they arrested her. She didn't plead. She didn't hide behind confusion. She spoke, calm, certain, almost proud, like she believed the Posse were the criminals for interrupting her. She explained her beliefs without hesitation, that her family carried what she called a sacred mountain lineage, and that the outside world was corruption. She twisted scripture into justification, quoting Old Testament passages about bloodlines and purity, claiming her sons must breed with their sister to keep the blood untainted. In her mind, it wasn't abuse, it was duty. She described the captives as tools in the ritual witnesses, whose forced observation sanctified the act, material if the bloodline needed strengthening, and sacrifices whose suffering supposedly purified the family's spiritual state. Her daughter, questioned separately, didn't talk like a collaborator celebrating a plan. She talked like someone who had lived inside a cage, so long the bars started feeling like safety. She described a lifetime of fear and religious manipulation, obedience drilled into her until right and wrong didn't exist outside her mother's voice. The sons, too, looked like men whose moral compass had been snapped early and never repaired, empty-eyed, moving only when ordered, like the cabin had trained them to be extensions of Elizabeth's will. By the time the statements were taken and the evidence packed, the case wasn't just about missing men anymore. It was about what isolation can breed when nobody checks the shadows, how scripture can become a weapon in the wrong hands, how family can become a prison, and how evil doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it arrives quiet, patient, and convinced it is holy. The trial of Elizabeth Pike began on September 12, 1895, and for once Pike County didn't feel like a forgotten corner of the world. People came from across Kentucky and the nearby states, packing the courthouse in Pikeville, just to look at the woman everybody was whispering about. The prosecution didn't need drama. There was too much proof. William Sturgis testified. Henderson's notes backed him up, and the physical evidence from the homestead sat heavy in the courtroom like it had its own voice. Elizabeth's defense tried to lean on insanity, but Elizabeth shut that down herself. She took the stand and insisted she was sane, that she acted under divine mandate, and that the law had no right to judge what she believed was God's design. The jury didn't take long. After less than 2 hours, they returned guilty verdicts on 7 counts of murder and 4 counts of kidnapping. Judge Marcus Caldwell sentenced Elizabeth to death by hanging, set for December 3, 1895. Her 2 surviving sons were convicted for their role in the crimes and received 20-year prison sentences. The daughter, viewed by the court as more victim than villain, was committed to the Central Kentucky Asylum, where she later died, never really escaping the damage done to her mind. When execution day came, Elizabeth walked to the gallows with the same cold calm she'd shown since the Posse arrived, speaking final words that sounded more like a warning than a farewell. Within minutes, it was over. She was buried in an unmarked grave outside Pikeville Cemetery, and folks refused her consecrated ground, like even the earth shouldn't honor her name. The aftermath didn't end with the hanging, because the community wanted the place itself erased. The day after her execution, locals burned the Pike cabin to the ground, watching the fire like it was a cleansing. Later, the underground chambers were dynamited and sealed under rock and soil, not just to destroy evidence, but to destroy the possibility that anyone could ever use that darkness again. People still avoided the land afterward, treating it like it carried a stink you couldn't wash off. Forest reclaimed the clearing fast, turning the homestead into nothing but a memory and a warning shared in low voices. William Sturgis returned to Lexington, but he didn't return whole. He lived with what he saw, what he smelled, what he heard in the dark, until his health gave out years later. The families of the murdered men finally received remains for burial, but it was a thin comfort after years of not knowing if their loved ones were dead or suffering, somewhere nobody could reach. The Pike case pushed changes in how rural disappearances were treated. More attention, more procedures, less shrugging and calling it just the mountains. Thornton's role in cracking the case shaped the rest of his life. and he spent his career pushing for better resources for lawmen who worked places where evil could hide behind distance. And that's what the story leaves behind. Not just a horror in a hidden chamber, but a reminder that isolation is sometimes the strongest protection evil can get. Because in the silence between settlements, where screams don't travel farther than wind through old oaks, what people ignore can grow teeth. After the rope snapped tight and the cabin went up in flames, folks in Pike County tried to act like the whole thing could be sealed away, the same way they sealed those chambers. Bury it, burn it, never speak on it again. But stories don't die the way bodies do. They travel. They slip into conversations on porches, into warnings told to kids who wander too far, into the little pauses people make when they pass Panther Creek and suddenly remember they're alone. Even in a county used to hardship, the Pike case left a stain that didn't wash out, because it wasn't just murder. It was a whole belief system built to justify it, and that scared people more than any single act of violence. In the years that followed, the official pieces stayed locked in courthouse records and old doctor notes, while the unofficial version grew teeth in mountain folklore. Some folks said the land went wrong after, like animals wouldn't bed down in that area, and hunters felt watched even with a clear ridge line behind them. Others swore they found strange depressions in the ground where the cellar used to be, like the earth never fully settled after the dynamite and the fill. Whether that's truth or a community's way of giving shape to fear, the result was the same. Nobody wanted that property, even when times got tight and good land was hard to find. Deputy Thornton carried it different from everyone else. He had spent years feeling the pattern and being forced to walk away because the law needed proof. Once the proof came, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like being late to a fire you warned people about while they laughed at the smoke. He pushed hard afterward for better follow up on missing persons, and for rural lawmen to treat gone as urgent, not normal. And even when the county tried to move on, the Pike case kept showing up as the example nobody wanted to repeat. What happens when isolation plus unquestioned authority turns a home into a private kingdom? And that's the part that still hits, because the real monster wasn't just a widow in a shuttered cabin. It was the space around her that made it easy. Miles of distance, months of no checks, a culture of minding your business because surviving already takes everything you got. That's how evil takes root in places like that. Quiet, patient, protected by the kind of silence people call peace. By the early 1900s, the Pike case had slipped out of headlines, but it never really left the mountains. It settled into the rhythm of Pike County the way old wounds do. You stop bleeding, but you still ache when the weather changes. New families moved through, new troubles took the spotlight, and the forest kept doing its job, pulling green over ash and covering the scars with leaves. Still, the spot where the Pike cabin stood didn't become normal land again. Folks treated it like a bad patch of ground you don't build on, don't camp on, don't even joke about too loud. The chambers were sealed, the clearing reclaimed, but the memory stayed, because people knew what had been allowed to exist there for years without anyone stopping it. The official record ended clean convictions, sentences, a hanging, a burned homestead, a sealed cellar. But the human record didn't end clean at all. Families buried their dead men and tried to stitch their lives back together, knowing no funeral can repay the years of not knowing. William Sturgis went home, but didn't mean safety anymore. His body healed wrong, and his mind never found sleep that didn't come with shadows. Thornton kept working, kept pushing for better rural investigations, carrying the case like a stone in his chest. And the daughter, caught between victimhood and participation, became the quiet proof that sometimes the worst damage isn't what's done to the body. It's what's done to a person's reality until they can't tell right from wrong without asking their abuser first. So what's the lesson when you strip away the legend and just look at the bones of it? It's this: evil doesn't always come roaring into town with a knife in its hand. Sometimes it builds itself a little kingdom in the dark where nobody checks, then it calls that kingdom holy. It uses fear, scripture, isolation, and obedience like tools, And it keeps going as long as the world keeps saying, "That's just how the mountains are." And that's why this story matters, even now. Because the silence that protected Elizabeth Pike wasn't supernatural. It was human. It was distance. It was neglect. It was the habit of shrugging at missing men and calling it fate. In the spaces between settlements, where screams don't carry farther than wind through ancient oaks, vigilance isn't paranoia, it's responsibility. If nobody looks, darkness gets comfortable. If nobody questions, cruelty becomes routine. And if nobody speaks, the worst kind of evil learns the best kind of hiding place. If you made it to the end, subscribe so we can keep pulling these forgotten horrors into the light. And comment your city below, because the truth only dies when no one is listening.